Thank you, Chairman. And I just wanted to come back to the broader strategy that we were talking about earlier. And thank you very much for coming along today. I mean, the challenges around this are pretty humbling in both the scale and the complexity of the threat that is that you are, as a team up against at the moment. But to General Mark, do you feel that this strategy? I mean, it's quite difficult to really grasp what it is. Do you feel that the men and women who are serving on these operations, do they really get it? Do they get the bigger picture? Do they get what we're going after? Do they feel entirely unencumbered? Is there more that you would like from the government, from us, from Parliament? Do they feel entirely unencumbered in this fight to degrade, to set the conditions for success, and whatever that success may look like in the Middle East?
Well, you'll recognise more than most, in a sense, the professional satisfaction that those engaged in this sort of struggle draw from it. And we've already heard the extent to which the Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment, found it professionally stimulating and challenging in terms of supporting the training of the Peshmerga. I don't think that the British Army per se feels that it either lacks for public support, material sustainment, or indeed a clear sense of what the purpose and object of the coalition effort in Iraq and Syria is. They've got a clear recognition now of the wider threat that Daesh represents. But they're working in support of an international effort, but more importantly with respect to Iraq, a sovereign government that needs to survive.
Okay, thank you. And more sort of general point, really, because I think we're coming to the end now, or towards the end.
Got a couple more after.
Sorry. But for people like me who have a very sort of low level understanding and engagement of these things and so on, then it would seem that we have made sort of two fundamental errors that have characterised the last 15 years of engagement, and one of those is the failure to really go for corruption. Perhaps in Afghanistan, and things like that, and in the fight at the moment. And the second one really is this sort of inability to really have the political stomach for the fight. So we have seen, we've often seen the operations previously in the Middle East and in Afghanistan defined by the electoral cycle in some cases, and the feeling that we've certainly come across in witnesses to this committee and in visits to Baghdad and so on, that we need to fundamentally rethink how we go about these things, and we need to have the stomach and the will to really see these things through. How do you think we can do that better, both in Parliament and nationally? And do you think we need to have a completely rejigging, a rethinking of how we see these operations as we tackle these more sort of diverse threats around corruption, counterinsurgency and asymmetric threats and all the rest of it?
These are big questions.
Sorry.
I'll do my best. These are big questions, and it may be, when the Chilcot report is published, that will give us further guidance towards answering them. On corruption, you have to be right. I mean, we have to, do far more, I think, to deal with the degree of corruption in these countries, and the Prime Minister has taken a lead there more recently in the Anti-Corruption Summit, and the transparency, the way in which our aid is more carefully directed, and the pressure that we and others are putting to bear on some of these regimes to root out corruption in their countries. On these bigger questions, of do we have the stomach for it? Are we doing it in the right way? I mean, these are very long. I think we have learned these are very long campaigns to try and establish some of the values, not necessarily Western values, but the values that we take for granted here, the values of freedom to the ability to get rid of a regime that you don't like, freedom to own property, freedom of expression, to get these values rooted in areas that they have not previously grown, is a long-term, undertaking. It takes years and billions of pounds and dollars. And thirdly, I think we've learned that in the end, when you're dealing with insurgency and terrorism, in the end, this has to be done by local forces. Simply putting Western boots or British boots on the ground, as we've learned fairly painfully, I think, in successive wars in Afghanistan, is not the total answer. But let's have a better military reply to these questions.
Well, I thought that was very clear, Secretary of State. I mean, from my perspective, you've spoken as to whether we have got the endurance for it. And if we think we need to have a sustained commitment, then there is clearly something about, wider and better informed strategic communications publicly as to the purpose and the degree of commitment that the nation should expect, and whether it's prepared to match that commitment with the resource and the political stomach, as you termed it, to see this thing through. From the military perspective, we've learnt that a campaign is of finite duration, even if the problem endures, and there's a limit, therefore, to political tolerance for that duration, and we need to use the time that we do have to best effect. And I think we might reflect on Afghanistan that we spent a near decade organising our inputs rather than being very clear about what our outputs are and ruthlessly focusing on those. We also determined that to get to the root of the problem, we had insufficient boots on the ground, and therefore the key metric was mass, but then discovered that mass actually was subordinate to legitimacy. And if there were reservations locally about one's very presence, one wasn't necessarily a net contributor. And we deduced from that therefore we needed an indigenous proxy legitimate element with which to engage. And it's easier in those countries where that exists, and of course it's that much more difficult in those countries where one has to create it.
Can we allow Dominic to have a go from the policy?
So the only thing I would add to that is to bring us back to where we started, or almost where we started, about the whole of government approach to these problems, which certainly in the 20 years that I've been dealing with them, 20 years ago they felt like very, very military problems for ministries of defence to deal with. It's so different to that now, partly, as the Secretary of State said, because of the National Security Council construct, but partly because of the way that the machine works underneath that. They are truly interagency problems, and we approach them in exactly that way, and that's a necessary lesson that we've learned over the years.